Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Walsh, a partner in Husch Blackwell's Renewable Energy Group. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience control console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit via the question box. We will try to answer questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the Resources folder. This program has been approved for continuing legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That is all for the housekeeping items. And now I'll get started with our program. We are excited to be talking with you about a high-level overview of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and Electric Reliability Council of Texas generator interconnection processes. Eric Lausten will provide a legislative update at the end of the program that will touch on tax legislation, Biden administration activities, and possible labor-related provisions affecting future renewable incentives. Joining me today is Sylvia Bartell, Eric Lausten, and Landon Lill. Sylvia focuses her practice on electric regulation. She counsels a variety of clients in the energy industry, including transmission companies, renewable and electric power generation investors and developers, vertically integrated utilities, and commercial and industrial customers. Eric Lausten brings more than 20 years of experience, including serving as a legislative director in 3 congressional offices, and most recently as Chief of Staff to Democrat Congressman Daniel Lipinski, a role he held for nearly 8 years. While serving for Representative Lipinski, Eric acted as lead policy and political advisor, providing oversight for the Congressman's active legislative and policy program. Having worked at the Public Utility Commission of Texas, Landon now helps energy market participants navigate complex regulatory requirements. He works on a broad range of wind and solar project transactions, drafting, reviewing, and negotiating interconnection agreements, and obtaining necessary regulatory approvals from state agencies and applicable market authorities. Now I will turn the discussion over to Sylvia Bartell.
Thank you, Linda. I will begin the FERC, or Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, portion of this webinar. So by way of introduction, FERC establishes standardized generator interconnection agreements and procedures that detail the pro forma requirements for interconnection to the FERC-regulated transmission system. FERC's pro forma generator interconnection agreements and procedures are generally adopted by each RTO, ISO, and FERC-regulated public utility with its own open access transmission tariff, referred to as an OAT. But all of these entities tailor FERC's pro forma requirements to their unique circumstances, resulting in different provisions and requirements across RTOs and ISOs. The RTO or ISO's FERC-approved OAT contains the generator interconnection procedures and agreements specific to that RTO or ISO. OATs can be accessed on FERC's website in the e-tariff portal or on the RTO and ISO's websites. RTOs and ISOs also provide interconnection guidance in the form of manuals, workshops, and customer information sessions. As a 101 webinar, the FERC portion of this presentation focuses on FERC's pro forma large generator interconnection agreements and procedures but we provide some RTO and ISO specific examples. This presentation refers to RTOs and ISOs, but the requirements discussed also apply to public utility transmission owners with their own OATs. That is, for transmission facilities that are not part of an RTO or ISO, but that are nonetheless subject to FERC's jurisdiction. A couple of general terms that will be helpful for the course of this presentation include the Large Generator Interconnection Procedures, referred to as LGIP, and Large Generator Interconnection Agreement, LGIA. They apply to a generating facility with a capacity of more than 20 megawatts. The Small Generator Interconnection Procedures, or SGIP, and the Small Generator Interconnection Agreement, or SGIA, apply to a generating facility of 20 megawatts or less. Some RTOs use different names for the agreements. For example, PJM refers to the GIA as the Interconnection Service Agreement, or ISA, and some RTOs simply use a single GIA, and they do not have separate large and small GIAs. The Generator Interconnection Agreement for each RTO is a standardized document and in practice is generally non-negotiable, as any deviation from the standard document requires FERC filing and approval, except the GIA attachments contain generator-specific information. Also, interconnection customer is generally a project company that's developing a renewable or electric generator, or it could be the entity that submits the interconnection request. So now as to types of interconnection services. There are generally two types of interconnection service: Energy Resource Interconnection Service, ERIS, and Network Resource Interconnection Service, NRIS. Energy Resource Interconnection Service means an interconnection service that allows the interconnection customer to connect its generating facility to the transmission provider's transmission system to be eligible to deliver the generating facility's electric output using the existing firm or non-firm capacity of the transmission provider system on an as-available basis. That is key. It's using the existing system on an as-available basis. By contrast, Network Resource Interconnection Service means an interconnection service that allows the interconnection customer to integrate its generating facility with the transmission system, one, in a manner comparable to that in which the transmission provider integrates its generating facilities to serve native load customers, or two, in the same manner as network resources. The RTO or ISO conducts technical analysis of the generator based on the type of interconnection service that it requests. Changing the interconnection service from ERIS to NRIS requires the RTO or ISO to conduct new technical studies, and it is generally considered to be a material modification that requires the interconnection customer to lose its queue position and submit a new interconnection request. We recommend double-checking the type of interconnection service that you request prior to submitting it to the RTO or ISO. The NRIS or ERIS selection can be a small item on the interconnection application, and as such, it can be inadvertently overlooked. Double-checking this item can help prevent a costly and timely issue down the road. We recommend double-checking the GIA appendix to ensure that it identifies the correct type of interconnection service. Investors, lenders, and potential future buyers will check this designation in due diligence because it impacts the generator's revenue and whether the generator can meet PPA obligations. Finally, surplus interconnection service. This means any unneeded portion of interconnection service established in a GIA, such that if surplus interconnection service is utilized, the total amount of interconnection service at the point of interconnection would remain the same. Generally, RTOs and ISOs are required to allow interconnection customers to utilize or transfer surplus interconnection at an existing POI, or point of interconnection. The existing interconnection customer or its affiliates get priority to utilize the surplus interconnection service. There is a lot of industry discussion regarding the opportunity to use surplus interconnection to develop co-located projects such as hybrid resources that utilize storage. There is currently a pending technical conference proceeding in FERC docket number AD 2019, wherein FERC is exploring barriers to hybrid resources. For more information on this, refer to Husch Blackwell's Emerging Energy Insights blog for a post that summarizes that proceeding. Now, moving on to submitting an interconnection request. A valid interconnection request includes a deposit, a completed application, which is provided in the GIP appendix, and a demonstration of site control or posting of additional deposit. This depends on the RTO or ISO. In the pro forma FERC procedures, site control is defined as documentation demonstrating 1. Ownership of, a leasehold interest in, or a right to develop a site for the purpose of constructing the generating facility. 2. An option to purchase or acquire a leasehold site for such purpose. Or 3. An exclusivity or other business relationship between an interconnection customer and the entity having the right to sell, lease, or grant interconnection customer the right to possess or occupy a site for such purpose. Each RTO or ISO will provide further details on site control requirements and timing in their OAT and generator interconnection manuals on their site. The RTO or ISO will acknowledge receipt of the interconnection request, and they will notify the applicant if the request is deficient. The interconnection customer must provide the requested information if it receives notice of a deficient application, or its request will be deemed withdrawn. As to a scoping meeting, once interconnection customer submits a valid interconnection request, the RTO or ISO will establish a scoping meeting to discuss alternative interconnection options, to exchange information, including any transmission data and earlier study evaluations that would reasonably be expected to impact such interconnection options, and to determine the potential feasible points of interconnection. As to OASIS posting, the RTO or ISO will maintain a list of all interconnection requests on its OASIS website, and many provide an interactive queue on their websites. As to withdrawal, the interconnection customer may voluntarily withdraw its interconnection request at any time by providing written notice. However, withdrawing results in loss of queue position, and the interconnection customer must pay the RTO or ISO all costs that the RTO or ISO incurred for the interconnection request plus interest. Depending on the cost and timing of the withdrawal, this can result in loss of deposits, study payments, or other milestone payments. As to identification of contingent facilities, the RTO or ISO will identify the method it uses to identify contingent facilities, that is, unbuilt interconnection facilities and network upgrades that the interconnection request's cost, timing, and study findings depend on. Finally, there are special procedures applicable to wind generators. GIP Appendix 7 provides specific procedures to a wind generating plant. Specifically, it allows the interconnection customer to provide a preliminary electrical design specification depicting the wind plant as a single generator. However, no later than 6 months after submitting an interconnection request, it must submit completed, detailed electrical design specifications. As to queue information, generally, the RTO or ISO assigns a queue position based on the date and time that it receives a valid interconnection request. As discussed above, withdrawal results in a loss of queue position. Additionally, moving a POI, point of interconnection, results in a lower queue position if deemed to be a material modification. Queue position is used to determine the order of performing the interconnection studies and to determine cost responsibility for facilities necessary to accommodate the interconnection request. As to clustering, the RTO or ISO has discretion to study interconnection requests in clusters. The opening and closing dates for the queue cluster window are posted on the RTO's or ISO's OASIS website. For example, these queue clusters are referred to as group studies in MISO. As to transferability of queue position, an interconnection customer may transfer its queue position to another entity only if such entity acquires the specific generating facility identified in the interconnection request and if the point of interconnection does not change. As to modifications, the interconnection customer may submit written notifications of its interconnection request to the RTO or ISO without losing its queue position if the modifications are not material modifications or if the modifications and timing are in the categories expressly allowed by the RTO's or ISO's tariff. Commercial operation date extensions of less than 3 cumulative years are not considered to be a material modification. They are handled through construction sequencing. And finally, technical change procedures. FERC directed RTOs and ISOs to develop a procedure for assessing and, if possible, accommodating technological changes to interconnection requests. The procedure is required to identify when a technological advancement can be incorporated into an interconnection request without the loss of queue position pursuant to the material modification provision. Further details on the technological change procedures and the definition of permissible technological advancements can be found in FERC Order Numbers 845 and 845A, as well as the specific tariffs for the RTOs and ISOs. With that, I will transition this over to my colleague Linda Walsh to continue the FERC portion of this webinar.
Thank you, Sylvia. I will be talking about interconnection studies, agreements, and subsequent construction items. First, the studies. There are 3 main interconnection studies that are required for a generator interconnection: a facility study, a system impact study, and a facility study. I'll talk a little bit about each one of these and then give some general information applicable to each based on FERC's pro forma large generator interconnection procedures. Note that the form, requirements, and timelines for these studies could vary from RTO to RTO and for transmission providers that are not part of an RTO. It's important to consult the region's specific tariff requirements and any applicable interconnection manuals that may have been developed. So first is the feasibility study. This is a preliminary evaluation of the system impact of interconnecting a generator to the transmission system. The transmission provider will provide a study report that contains a list of facilities needed and a non-binding good faith estimate of cost responsibility and an estimate of the time to construct the necessary facilities. This study is basically to determine if the proposed interconnection is feasible as it's proposed. The timing of the feasibility study begins at the point where there is a valid interconnection request. At that point, the transmission provider will provide a standard form of feasibility study agreement and a good faith estimate of the cost for completing the study. Before the study can begin, the interconnection customer must provide a deposit of $10,000 and any requisite technical data. From that point, the transmission provider will use reasonable efforts to complete the study in 45 days. If the feasibility study uncovers any unexpected results not contemplated earlier in the process, a substitute point of interconnection identified either by the interconnection customer or by the transmission provider, can be substituted for the originally designated point of interconnection. And this can be done without a loss of queue position, but restudies may be needed. If the interconnection customer and transmission provider can agree to forego the feasibility study, the transmission provider can instead initiate the system impact study and apply the $10,000 deposit toward the system impact study. That leads us to the second type of study, the system impact study. So unlike the feasibility study, the system impact study is an engineering study which evaluates the impact of the proposed interconnection on the safety and reliability of the transmission provider's transmission system, and also any potentially affected systems other than the transmission provider system. It is intended to identify the impact, if any, to the transmission system that would result if the generating facility were interconnected without any modification to the generating project or the transmission system. The timing of this study coincides with the delivery of the feasibility study report, if one's done. At that time, the transmission provider will provide a standard form of system impact study agreement and, again, a non-binding good faith estimate of the cost and time frame for completing the study. The interconnection customer must execute the system impact study agreement within 30 days, provide a demonstration of site control, a $50,000 deposit, and any necessary technical data before the transmission provider will undertake the study. The transmission provider will use reasonable efforts to complete the study within 90 days after the receipt of the executed agreement. And within 90 days after the close of the queue cluster window, if the transmission provider uses clustering. If the system impact study uncovers any unexpected results not contemplated earlier, again, an alternative point of interconnection can be substituted for the originally designated point of interconnection without any loss of queue position, but restudies, again, may be necessary. The system impact study report will consist of a short circuit analysis, a stability analysis, and a power flow analysis. It will also provide a list of facilities that are required for the interconnection request and a non-binding good faith estimate of the cost responsibility and the estimated time to construct. The transmission coordinator will coordinate the system impact study with any affected system that is impacted by the interconnection, and the transmission provider will utilize any existing studies to the extent practical. The third type of study is the facilities study. The facility study is the most involved study and the most expensive. It will determine the list of facilities required for the transmission provider's interconnection facilities and network upgrades as identified in the system impact study. It will also evaluate the engineering, procurement, and construction work needed to implement the conclusions of the system impact study. The facilities study report will provide an estimate of the cost of the needed facilities and the time needed to complete them. The timing of the facility study coincides with the delivery of the system impact study report. At that time, the transmission provider will provide a standard form of facility study agreement. The interconnection customer must execute the facility study agreement within 30 days, provide additional required technical data and a deposit of $100,000 or the interconnection customer's portion of the estimated monthly cost of conducting the facility study, which could be higher. The transmission provider will use reasonable efforts to complete the facility study within 90 days with no more than a plus or minus 20% cost estimate. or the interconnection customer can choose a 180-day response time with a plus or minus 10% cost estimate. All of the studies I just mentioned consider the base case flow, short circuit, and stability databases for the transmission system as they exist at the time of the study. Now, that will include all generators that, as of the date of the study, are directly interconnected to the transmission system, are interconnected to affected systems, and may have an impact on the interconnection request, have a pending higher queued interconnection request, or have an executed LGIA, which is the Large Generator Interconnection Agreement, or have requested that an unexecuted LGIA be filed with FERC. Of course, changes in these assumptions could cause the need to restudy the interconnection request. For example, a restudy may be required due to a higher queued project dropping out of the queue, or a modification of a higher queued project, or redesignation of the point of interconnection. The cost of any restudy must be paid for by the interconnection customer, including any changes in cost responsibility for required network upgrades caused by any changed circumstances. The timeline for restudies could vary between 45 and 60 days. Also, delays in any of these studies could occur at any time. The transmission provider is required to notify the interconnection customer of any delay with an estimated completion date. And if requested, the transmission provider will supply supporting documentation, work papers, and relevant pre-power flow, short circuit, and stability databases for the system impact and facilities studies, subject to confidentiality agreements. And this can provide the interconnection customer the ability to check study results and assumptions. After each of the studies is complete, the interconnection customer will have an opportunity to provide comments to the transmission provider. Next, we have the key agreements that a developer can expect to encounter. We've already discussed the various study agreements, so I'll move on to the next one, the engineering and procurement agreement. The engineering and procurement agreement authorizes the transmission provider to begin engineering and procurement of long lead time items that might be necessary to meet an in-service date. The engineering and procurement agreement can be executed before a large generator interconnection agreement is executed, but it won't expedite the project's queue position or its in-service date. The project will be required to pay the cost of all activities authorized in the engineering and procurement agreement and to make advanced payments or provide other satisfactory security for the cost. The interconnection customer could also be on the hook for any cancellation costs for equipment that is ordered if such items or equipment later become unnecessary. Next is the standard large generator interconnection agreement. This is a standard form of interconnection agreement applicable to an interconnection request for a generating facility that is greater than 20 megawatts. There is a separate small generator interconnection agreement applicable to generators less than 20 megawatts. The transmission provider will provide a draft LGIA together with draft appendices within 30 days after receiving the interconnection customer's comments on the facility study report. The appendices contain the technical specifications of the facility and milestones for their completion. The interconnection customer will have 30 days to return the draft appendices. The transmission provider and interconnection customer can negotiate appendices to the draft LGIA for up to 60 days after the final facility study report is completed. At this point, if the interconnection customer believes that negotiations are at an impasse, it can request that the transmission provider submit an unexecuted LGIA with FERC, or initiate dispute resolution procedures. If the interconnection customer requests termination of the negotiations, but does not request either the filing of an unexecuted LGIA or initiate dispute resolution, it will be deemed to have withdrawn its interconnection request. And unless otherwise agreed by the parties, if the interconnection customer has not executed the LGIA, requested the filing of an executed LGIA, or initiated dispute resolution procedures within 60 days, it shall be deemed to have withdrawn its interconnection request. It is important to be mindful of these specific dates that are applicable to this process in the specific region where the project is located to ensure that the project does not inadvertently lose queue position. Generally, within 15 days after receiving the final LGIA, the interconnection customer is required to provide evidence of continued site control, or in lieu of that, the project can post a $250,000 non-refundable additional security, which will be applied toward future construction costs if the project proceeds. In addition, the project could be required to provide evidence that one or more of the other project milestones have been achieved, such as execution of a fuel supply contract, a cooling water supply contract, contract for engineering or procurement of major equipment, execution of a PPA contract, or application for an air, water, or land use permit. At this point, again, the interconnection customer can request that the transmission provider file an unexecuted LGIA. If filed, an executed LGIA will contain the terms and conditions deemed appropriate by the transmission provider. Once the interconnection agreement is executed or an unexecuted LGIA is filed, the interconnection customer and transmission provider can proceed with their respective obligations under the LGIA. Next, we turn to the construction of transmission providers' interconnection facilities and network upgrades. Transmission provider and interconnection customer will negotiate a construction schedule for the transmission provider's interconnection facilities and the network upgrades based on the in-service date of the project and the time needed for completion of the necessary upgrades. It is possible to expedite the construction of network upgrades so as to maintain a project's in-service date. In that case, the interconnection customer must commit to pay associated expediting costs in addition to any cost responsibility for the upgrades. It is also possible to request expedited construction of network upgrades on the transmission provider system that were otherwise already part of the transmission provider's expansion plan. Again, the interconnection customer must commit to pay any expediting costs. Note that as with the studies I discussed above, the form, requirements, and timelines for the interconnection agreements and construction processes could vary from RTO to RTO and for transmission providers not part of an RTO. So it is important to consult the region's specific tariff requirements and any applicable interconnection manuals that have been developed. Now I will turn the discussion over to Landon Lill, who will discuss the ERCOT interconnection process.
Thanks, Linda. As with most things in ERCOT, we do things a bit differently than the rest of the country. ERCOT has its own process for interconnecting generation, as it's not under FERC's jurisdiction, at least with respect to interconnections. Now, the ERCOT interconnection process can be divided into 3 stages. Stage 1 is just the filing of an interconnection request. And the second stage is registration and modeling. The third stage is the physical interconnection process itself, energizing, synchronizing, commissioning, etc., and the various approvals and tests that go with these activities. At the completion of this third stage, the project is given a resource commissioning date and is fully commissioned on the ERCOT grid. The first part of stage 1 is the submission of what's called the GENER, and that stands for the Generation Resource Interconnection or Change Request. That's just basically the basic information about the project, has some contact in it, and attached to it is a requirement that you submit the screening study fee. Now, the screening study, which is actually optional, is conducted by ERCOT itself, and the purpose is to look for high-level issues that will help a project company decide whether it wants to go forward with interconnecting a proposed resource. ERCOT also uses the screening study to evaluate whether there's a potential for subsynchronous resonance, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But once that's been completed, and if the company has decided that it wants to move forward, the next step is to move towards the full interconnection study. Now, the full interconnection study is made up of 4 or sometimes 5 components, and that's the steady state and transfer analysis, a short circuit and breaker duty review, the dynamic and transient stability analysis, and the facility study. The first 3 are looking at the technical engineering ability of the project to interconnect. The 4th one, the facility study, is looking at the physical structures needed to interconnect that need to get built by the transmission service provider, or also by the generator itself. And it has also cost estimates, and these are important because it will ultimately determine what the security will be required for whenever a generation interconnection agreement is eventually executed. Now, to start off with the FIS study, 4 things need to happen. First is that you need to execute what's called the Facilities Interconnection Study Agreement with your transmission service provider. This is just a contract. It says, in exchange for paying X amount of dollars, transmission service provider will actually perform this study. And there's some room for negotiation, and we've historically had pretty good luck with modifying these to make them suitable for specific clients. And some transmission providers, service providers are sort of a take it or leave it, some aren't. The next part is submission of the resource integration form. Then there's the payment of the stability modeling fee. This is actually a fee that goes to ERCOT. And then finally, there's proof of site control. Site control has to be maintained before the FIS study starts, and it has to be continued to be maintained all the way through the execution of the SGIA agreement. Now, site control just means that you own the land outright, maybe you have a lease. It can also include an option for a lease. So you don't have to actually have the land in your physical possession right now, you just have to have control over it. After the FIS study, or actually concurrently, there's 2 other studies that need to occur. One of them is called the reactive power study. It's pretty short, and the second one is only required in some projects, and that's the subsynchronous residence study. That, if during the screening study, ERCOT determines that a subsynchronous resonance study is needed, they'll look to make sure that there will be no resonance. And what that is a phenomenon in which the resonant frequencies of the generator coincide with the natural resonant frequency of the electric system. And what can happen is both the generator or something on the system can get damaged. So if ERCOT decides it's needed, then it has to do a study, or if the transmission provider decides of their own volition that one's needed, you have to go through the SSR study. And this can take a long time. So it starts during this phase, but it doesn't actually finish until stage 3, which I'll get to later. And then after those studies, the next step in the process is to execute the ERCOT SGIA. Now, unlike the FERC process was the large one and the small one, in ERCOT, there's only one size. It applies to all generation that's receiving transmission service, even if that generation resource is taking transmission service at distribution voltage. And it can occur earlier, actually before the full interconnection studies, if the parties mutually agree on it. And to be clear, when I said all generation, that's only generation participating in the wholesale power market, not distributed generation. They have a separate agreement. After all of these things have been completed, the next move is the initial compliance review. And it's sort of the final, it's towards the end of what we call stage 1. And what that is it's a review by ERCOT to determine if the project can meet ERCOT's operational standards. ERCOT has 90 days to complete it once all the prerequisites have been complete. And these prerequisites are listed on the slide, and I'll just go through a couple of the major ones. And that's having an actual executed SJA and that all the data from the screening study and FIS study has been submitted. The FIS study doesn't have to be completed. It just needs to have the underlying data needs to have already been gathered, and that's what ERCOT uses. And then also they need a written notice from the transmission service provider that your interconnecting entity has issued a notice to proceed and posted financial security. So 90 days after that, ERCOT will come with a review and they'll say, you know, it passes or it doesn't pass. At this stage, it's not the end of the world if the project doesn't pass. There's plenty of time to fix that as we go forward. Simultaneously, there's also what's called the Quarterly Stability Assessment. And this is a group study of all the proposed generation within a 3-month time period, and it looks for stability issues. Now, to be included, you need to have the same prerequisites as for the compliance review, but you also need to have your FIS studies complete, the reactive power study complete, and any system improvements or mitigation plans that were identified in those studies. As a practice tip, there's about a 6-month lag between when a project is eligible for inclusion in the QSA and the first possible initial synchronization date. So if you want to synchronize, let's say between April and June, the prerequisites need to be met before November 1st. So here's where it gets tricky. Because they're conducted only once each quarter, missing the deadline, say like the November 1st deadline, if you got your stuff in on November 1st instead of the day before, instead of being able to synchronize between April and June, you'd be stuck having to synchronize between July, August, or September. But it can be very difficult to schedule transmission outages that are required for the interconnection process during the summer. And currently this year, ERCOT market notice classified summer is May 15th through September 15th. So the actual delay for missing your QSA inclusion, particularly if you're looking at the November deadline, can be much longer than just 3 months. All this to say, it's important to plan ahead and make sure that you're on target for your selected dates, and to keep the summer in mind. And that brings us to sort of stage 2 of the process, which is registration and modeling. Registration just means registering the project as a company, as a resource entity, and it would include designating a qualified scheduling entity, and it's called QEESI. The QEESI is the entity that will actually do the talking with ERCOT. Often project companies are their own QEESI, but often they use a third-party one, it's NAFTA or Shell. And at the same time, you also need to submit a resource asset registration form. This actually gets submitted multiple times throughout the project. And then you also identify a production load date. And so really once those first 2 things have been happened, that's when you get your production load date. It used to be called a model ready date for those of you who've been around a while. And that once you have that date, that's sort of like the beginning of the home stretch as you move into energizing your project. So once that happens, all the dates going forward will align to that model ready date. And that just means when ERCOT will actually start including the project in their main model. That goes to the 3rd stage, which is the new generator, really the new generator commissioning checklist. So there are 3 parts. The first part is just a request for energization, and that you get permission to energize the project. And there's 2 really important prerequisites. The first is that your modeling needs to be complete, and the second is that the interconnection facilities themselves are complete. You can't connect the project if you can't plug it in. After you've received approval there, the next step is a series of tests that enable you to synchronize the project, and that's called part 2 of the checklist. The main prerequisites, aside from the tests, are passing of the 16.5 compliance review, and then it performed the subsynchronous resonance study, and any required upgrades associated with that have been completed. So once the tests have been completed and you've passed those 2 things, you'll get approval to synchronize the project to operate up to 20 MVA. And then once the resource has demonstrated it can curtail and provide voltage support service, it'll get permission to exceed 20 MVA. At this point, the project can pretty much operate on the grid and they will only need to be taken off for a couple more times just to do some tests as part of the Part 3, Checklist Part 3. There's an expectation, and Checklist Part 3 is the final test, and that enables the project to be officially commissioned. There's an expectation that the whole process will be completed within 90 days, so that they don't want people to say, hey, we made it to Part 2, got approval to operate above 20 MVA, we're done, thanks. They need you to finish within 90 days. Delays are common and frequent, but ERCOT expects generators to try to expeditiously complete the process. And that's it. On to Eric.
Great, thank you, Landon. Welcome everybody from Washington, D.C. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what's happening in Congress and with the new administration with regards to some matters of interest. So as you all know, we are in a period of time where we just saw Congress and the administration enact a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that largely consumed the Senate over the past 2 months, and besides nominations, they have done little else. But we expect them to soon pivot to bigger and broader things with an eye towards energy and infrastructure. President Biden is expected to release his initial skinny budget next week. Typically, a president would release their budget proposal in February, but because of the inauguration and transition and some of the delays inherent in that, we'll get a slimmed-down budget released next week, a more fulsome one in May, and this will be our first post-election detailed look at the policy proposals put forward by the new president. We do expect Congress to move swiftly to an infrastructure package that is going to be very broadly scoped. We expect that to include in the House, not just your typical surface transportation, but also energy and environmental issues, housing, broadband, and many other items. We foresee action in committees as soon as May, and a goal to have a big bill on the House floor by June or July. While there have been discussions about some of the infrastructure bills moving through the Senate in their committees later this spring, it's unclear what their floor schedule is going to be. Based on the current alignment of the House and Senate, it's going to pose some challenges in the legislative process ahead for some of the new president's goals. There's interesting questions about whether or not they're going to be able to be enacted in a bipartisan fashion, questions about whether or not Congress will go back to using the reconciliation process, whether or not these items will have a revenue component to them and whether they'll be paid for, and of course the 50-50 Senate filibuster, the Senate 50-50 Senate alignment will raise many questions about the future of the filibuster. With regards to energy and climate change, we did have a discussion a month ago on this call about the GREEN Act, which is the House's Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Tax Policy Bill. There has been no action on that yet, but we do expect the Ways and Means Committee to hold hearings likely in May. In the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Clean Future Act has been introduced. This is H.R. 1512. This is a comprehensive energy policy legislation and has commenced having hearings this week, including our new strategic partner, Dr. Karen Wayland, who testified on a hearing about grid resiliency yesterday. Ultimately, we foresee a broadly scoped infrastructure bill, perhaps in multiple different components, scoping out as big as $3 trillion. This is something that is a very ambitious goal from President Biden and among House Democrats, although it's going to be very unclear how something of that size and scope can move through the Senate. The Clean Future Act, H.R. 1512, is an about 1,000-page document that touches on a number of areas related to energy policy and infrastructure. The bill starts out with a very broad national climate target goal, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 50% by 2030, just a short 9 years away, and to have a net zero goal of 2050. The fundamental core of this will be a clean energy standard, which will require all retail electricity suppliers to reach 80% clean energy by 2030 and 100% by 2035. The bill would also establish a credit program which entities can buy, sell, and trade credits to demonstrate their compliance, and also earn short-term extensions if they are making progress towards their goals. Interestingly, we do foresee some conflicts regarding this. While the utility sector has been supportive of a clean energy standard, and over 40% of all American households are covered by utilities that have pledged support for a clean energy standard. A number of folks on the Republican side of the aisle, as well as people in the oil and gas sector, are far more supportive of a carbon pricing regime involving carbon taxes or some other approach. The clean energy standard is also a fundamental part of President Biden's climate change agenda, and will be interesting to see how that's articulated in his budget and further policy documents released next week and beyond. The Clean Future Act also includes new efficiency standards and grants and resources to improve the efficient use of energy among houses and facilities, expand electric vehicle infrastructure and other clean transport measures, includes provisions to decarbonize manufacturing and other industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and includes various other sections related to technology development, environmental justice, superpollutants, waste reduction, and workforce development. We expect this bill to be considered before the committee in the early May timeframe. Looking further ahead, there's quite a lot of challenges that are going to be facing these ambitious goals. In the House, there has been quite a lot of discussion about pushing these bills through in a bipartisan way. However, a very similar legislative package moved through the House last summer and was very much a partisan measure. If you were to ask Republicans, I think that they would say the voice they're hearing from Democrats is, we'd love to have you support our measure, as opposed to asking for their input. Another main question is, will this proceed in a single bill or a multiple bill process, and whether or not this bill or various bills will move through the reconciliation process again. For those unfamiliar, the reconciliation process is what was used to enact the $1.9 trillion COVID package and is seen as a fairly partisan measure. But in addition to that, it also has limitations on what types of policy language can be included in those legislative packages, and is generally focused on fiscal measures having an effect on the federal budget, and does not necessarily include items that may be fundamental to this greenhouse gas emission and climate change goal, including the clean energy standard, whereas a carbon pricing or carbon tax effort could pass through the reconciliation process. In the Senate, where you have a 50-50 split, and among various Democrats, including Senator Joe Manchin, who incidentally is the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, it's unclear whether big, ambitious measures like this can pass, but for going through the reconciliation process. But again, that has strict limitations on what can go through those types of legislative procedures and could create interesting challenges. And again, a main question here is going to be whether or not any revenue is included to pay for these, including rolling back some of the 2017 tax cuts, or whether or not they will continue to add to the deficit. There are also some interesting questions emerging with regards to tax policy. In the House, we've talked about the Green Act, which would extend many of the current tax credits for renewable energy into the future, providing some certainty over the next 5 to 7 years. The clean energy sector has asked for a longer-term level of certainty, as up to 10 years of tax credit extensions. And in the Senate, Finance Chairman Ron Wyden has proposed consolidating all 44 current energy-related tax credits into 3 separate buckets, one of which for energy, that would be based on performance levels for both production and investments, whether or not they are reaching certain carbon intensity goals. And whether or not a carbon tax is entered into this policy debate is another interesting question. Further down the road, there are a number of concerns that are being voiced by the union and labor community with some of the Democratic goals here, including whether or not the future green economy will provide sufficient jobs and opportunities to them that match the current opportunities they have now, employed in areas like building out Keystone Pipeline, involved in coal mining and other so-called dirty sectors. And they have begun talking about new provisions that would help support their jobs in the future, including Buy American requirements for clean energy facilities and equipment, project labor agreements, and prevailing wages for those involved in the installation of clean energy facilities and technology. Welcome any questions that you might have, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for continuing legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.